from last week, you'll recall that I posed this argument and posited this approach, that if we're calling this series Repatriating Anthropology, I'm going to suggest that what I mean by that is a question of addressing the so-called crises in anthropology, but addressing it in a way that turns those into methodological questions. It recognizes that really, if ethnography, if getting into the field, if being thrown into a place where you are attempting to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange is a kind of self-imposed crisis, then anthropology has sort of always been in crisis. And so we ought to operationalize that a little bit. And so I've asked of taking the three stages that were talked about last week of crisis in the history of anthropology and turning them into questions of the empirical, a question of the ethical, and a question of the instrumental, and that we could ask of any sort of site in which we're inquiring anthropologically, how do these three questions come together? And so I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to remind you to pose that question to yourself as you go through and follow through with me in this next lecture. What we'll do is we'll go through an introduction. I'll get into questions of Hopi epistemological limits. I'll turn to a theme I'm calling Arguing with Tradition, which is named after my first book, and gets into some of the data there and some of the data that I presented in the first week from the courtroom, and then I'll wrap up with some conclusions. So first, an introduction. Here is an image. I don't know how many of you, if anyone is familiar with this image, seen it before. This is a fantastic image, from the Illustrated Police News, March 6, 1886, printed in London. And it shows Matilda Cox Stevenson, a well-known proto-ethnologist who was sent from the Bureau of American Ethnology by John Wesley Powell himself, the founder, to go and record and collect as much as she could from the Southwest. She took her intrepid husband with her, who was there brandishing that rifle behind her, and she made her way to various pueblos in New Mexico and eventually to the village of Oraibi, which is the eastern or westernmost village of the Hopi Nation, what's now the Hopi Nation. And so she got up to the top, and when she got up there, she attempted to descend into the ceremonial chamber, which is here in evidence. Here in evidence. Is it working? No. Here in evidence by the ladder, underground ceremonial kiva with the guy coming up, and she stopped, and she's just outraged that she has been stopped. And so she is insisting, and as you can see, these Hopi men who are depicted here are insisting back. And the title of the article that this accompanied was "A Craven Red Villain Cowed by White Heroine, Anthropology at Work," or something like that. Here is a classic image of 19th century hero scientist insisting upon the pursuit of an epistemological project that is going to get to the bottom, quite literally, of what Hopi is all about. And she was successful. Eventually, she did make her way into the kiva. She did end up collecting a lot of information, not as much as she thought, not as much as she liked, but nonetheless, she made her way in. The point I want to focus on, though, is the resistance, or at least the refusal. If you see in this picture, I'm not so sure that quote-unquote red villain is quite so cowed. You can see that someone has a lasso in the back there, waiting to pounce, and it doesn't at all look to me like she's necessarily going to get the best of them. Of course, this was a dramatization. But what I want to point out is Matilda Cox Stevenson was one of the very first ethnologists, ethnographers to get to Hopi, at least American ethnographers to get to Hopi. And I think it is telling that from the very beginning, Hopi people have taken exception to Euro-American epistemological projects. And in fact, every effort, and I will recount some of them, to know a complete picture of Hopi life has been resisted, refused, or otherwise thwarted, so much so that even some of the more recent ethnographers, and from up until the mid and late 20th century, were absolutely convinced that there was no totaling to be had. And so I want to argue in this paper and this lecture that the resistance or refusal to Euro-American inquiry actually resonates with how Hopi knowledge itself is produced, transmitted, and monitored by and between Hopi. That Hopi-Wilta relations and Navoti traditional knowledge come together in constraining and affording many aspects of Hopi life. This lecture is decidedly not, and I say to the camera, not about the content of Hopi knowledge. I say that because I too may find myself on the wrong end of some angry Hopi if it were presented as such. It is, in fact, rather about questions of access, questions of limits to something called Hopi traditional knowledge. And it's about the claiming, disclaiming, performing, and resisting performances of this access to knowledge that I'm centrally interested in. For Hopi, knowledge, Navoti, tradition, is a property-like resource claimed by some to the exclusion of others. Yes, knowledge, in this sense, Navoti, has a quality of being powerful, and I will focus and explain a little bit about that. In Hopi metaphysical and cosmological perspectives, it absolutely is vital, powerful stuff. But what I also want to focus on is the extent to which knowledge here is an indicator of authority. And I want to be clear about the distinction. And so the way I'll be clear about these distinctions is by making the case that these epistemological limits, which I hope will be familiar to some of those who maybe work in museums and have encountered or been concerned with questions of repatriation and how and when and the extent to which there ought to be a negotiation about heeding the values and perspectives and beliefs of native peoples or descendant communities, that these questions of epistemological limits do have some element of power involved, do have an instrumental quality, but they're not just that. They do have a degree of identity politics attached to it, a question of, am I being recognized as such? But they're not just that. And so in saying that Hopi epistemological limits are about authority, I want to argue how knowledge access and limits of the sort that I'm going to show you, not just the sort that Matilda Cox Stevenson encountered, but some like it, and then some in the Hopi courtroom, involve performances of authority and a kind of claim to self-determination, not of a power notion of sovereignty, though again it certainly is that, but specifically of a question of authority. And why authority matters here is because authority requires a certain kind of recognition, a certain kind of sociality and relationship that I think is also in the offing here, where power can be a discussion of coercion or a discussion of violence. Authority requires a certain kind of expression of and assent to a notion of legitimacy. And I want to talk about the way in which that legitimacy is posited from a Hopi perspective, the way in which it is itself limited from a Hopi perspective, all invite the interpretation that what is going on in these epistemological limits, in these limiting moments, is a kind of invitation to an ongoing relationship, however painful and tortured that might be, a relationship that entails, in the best circumstances, a measure of recognition, in the best circumstances, a measure of reciprocity, and in the best circumstances, a kind of interdependence and even a kind of mutual dignity. And if we start there with thinking about what Hopi epistemological limits are about, and we understand how that can be understood from a Hopi perspective as grounded deeply in the way in which epistemological limits are worked out in their own community, we begin to get a different sense of both what Hopi is becoming, that is, how Hopi is continuing on into the present and the future, and how it is expanding, reaching out, touching, and encountering the world that posits itself as non-Hopi and invites a relationship with it. First, of course, I want to say, let's get so clear on some categories. I say here, what do we mean by knowledge? But I want to say, what do I mean by knowledge? And I'm going to rely upon this, of course, is a very long and elaborate conversation in the Western canon. But for the purposes here, I'm going to argue and rely upon a very classic definition, Enlightenment-based definition from analytic philosophy that calls knowledge not just truth, not just a claim to truth, not just an intentional claim to truth, and not just a sincere intentional claim to truth, but something more than that together. Analytic philosophy describes and defines knowledge as a justified true belief. This is a classic philosophical definition. Here's the logical, syllogistic working it out. We could say that S subject knows that P, something to be known, if and only if, first, P is true, second, that S believes that P, and third, that S is justified in believing that P. So, why is knowledge not just truth? Why is knowledge not just a true belief? Well, it takes a few thoughts, a few games of logic, but it doesn't take long to realize that we assess someone's capacity for having knowledge or as someone who is knowledgeable, not just because what they have stated or claimed ends up being true in some way or another. That is, if I woke up today and I said, "It's going to rain today," my status of having made that claim does not bring to me the status of being a knower. Why? Because it's just pure luck that it ended up raining today. I would have had to have had some secondary explanation for why I am justified in coming to the conclusion that I am asserting when I say it's going to rain today. And in fact, if you or I were in a conversation, you would say, "Why do you think it's going to rain today?" And I might say, "Well, look at the clouds," or "I saw the weather report," or any sort of reason. And it is in the very giving and asking of reasons that we begin to understand how knowledge is accomplished and what knowledge as a status of being a knower, is. It's not just truth. If I flip a coin and say tails, it's going to be tails, and it's tails. I don't get to be the holder of a truth. I'm just damn lucky. It has to be backed by some justification. What is a justification? A justification is a belief whose claim then, in some way or another, whose claim to truth, a justified true belief, is a belief whose claim to truth is assessed, measured, and validated. This assessment can happen through various kinds of internal or external operations. We can say, well, we can make reference to what I was thinking in my mental state at the time that I made this kind of claim, and that could be enough. And for some philosophers, the argument is it's an entirely mental operation. We could say, though, alternatively, that it is entirely an external operation, that really what we have to do is point to some external indicator of some kind of standard against which to evaluate the truth of my claim. Either way, justification requires some evaluation against a normative standard. That is, against something that is given the authority of being a standard, a norm, against which to assess the truth of the claim. Okay, so you say, well, then what's authority? And here we go. For me, authority, and what I mean by authority in this talk and how it relates to epistemological limits of the sort I'm going to be describing, rest on two fundamental definitions. One that you might know about more than the other. And I want to introduce the other one after I introduce the one you know about. This is the one I hope you know about. Hannah Arendt wrote an important and influential paper in 1961 called What is Authority? An essay in which she bemoaned what she saw as the virtual and complete and utter loss of anything like authority in the modern world. Well, what did she mean? She certainly didn't mean power or violence. In fact, she said, what I mean by authority, whatever it is precisely the opposite of power, coercion, and violence. The use of force, in fact, is the failure of authority. So then what is she talking about? Well, she said, I'm also not talking about mere persuasion, me convincing you in some democratic republic that this is right or the proper thing to do. I mean something more than just an argument, more than just a claim that could change in the next moment. But I also mean more than just coercing you into following my rule. And though authority can mean and does demand obeisance, it does. That's what authority does. It demands a kind of following. It is not, Arendt argues, the kind that necessarily entails violence. And she goes back to the Romans, and she goes back to the Greeks, and she goes back to classical thoughts. She goes back to, in fact, the very earliest sort of recording of a term from which authority comes from, and it comes from the Roman word auctoritas. And she says it derives from the verb augere, or to augment. And what authority or those in authority constantly augment is the foundation. So the founding becomes an moment, the founding of a social order, the founding of some political arrangement, the founding of the Roman Republic, whatever have you, then gets augmented by those in authority. How? Through tradition. Precedents, the deeds of ancestors, and the usage that grew out of them, she says, were always binding. Anything that happened was transformed into an example, and the auctoritas became identical with authoritative models for actual behavior, with the moral political standard as such. So she argues that when we say authority, in essence, we mean nothing more or less than a kind of continuity, a kind of making sense morally, ethically, about the present by virtue of some established, legitimized, and believed past authority, past way of doing things. Tradition, she says, preserved the past by handing down from one generation to the next the testimony of the ancestors. As long as tradition was uninterrupted, authority was inviolate, and to act with authority and tradition without accepted, time-honored standards and models was inconceivable. What, in essence, she's talking about is a shared community of meaning for whom the rules are known in advance to a certain degree. And this is her model of what authority is. But I want to suggest that with this other guy I'm about to introduce to you, we can think of authority as a set of established standards that nonetheless are always under revision, elaboration, and a kind of augmentation of the sort that needs to be attended to, but also needs to be understood as the work that tradition does as authoritative. And the person I'm talking about here is Robert Brandom. Now, Robert Brandom is a pragmatic philosopher. He was a student of a man named Wilfrid Sellars. He was a close student of Richard Rorty. He followed and admired their work deeply and has written extensively about the history of pragmatism and also his own arguments, which are an argument for a kind of melding of analytic philosophy and its commitments to meaning with American philosophical pragmatism and its commitments to doing. And what he says is authority, particularly in the context of knowledge, of a justified true belief, authority is very much in the very act of assessment and assent. Where authority emerges, where it is invoked, is in the social relationships of asking, giving, and asking for reasons why you have a claim that you make. And those reasons are sometimes explicit, but most often implicit. And we, as interlocutors, when we meet each other, when we talk to each other, are constantly at work assessing, what is it that he is saying to me when he says hello? What is it that she's saying to me when she says get out? What is it that, this person is saying when they say have a beer? We're constantly assessing what that means by asking what generally, authoritatively, would we understand the world to be if it meant what I think it means, and therefore how shall I act in relationship to that? Authority is in the assessment and the assenting to the implicit claim that anyone is making when they make a representation or state something to be a case. If I were to say, it's raining outside, what would you do? You might turn and look and say, wrong. She did in the back. Your turning and looking is an assessment and a dissent. And so then you say, well, why on earth would he say it's raining when maybe he can't see? Maybe his glasses are fogged up. You'd come with all sorts of secondary rationalizations. But what that does in those practices is implicitly authorize the engagement, the encounter. And so authority, just as Arendt says, authority is worked out in the relations that are articulated, that unfold, that are being participated in, presupposed, and built up in moments of encounter and engagement and conversation. And so what we mean by knowledge then is also trucking along with it questions of normativity, questions of sociality, questions of ethics, questions of instruments. And in fact, the example of, well, I look outside and I see it's factually not raining. Well, the only way in which that works as a fact, says Bradman, is the way they work and have normative significance as a standard by which to assess the correctness of my claim that it's raining is only in the context of someone else's attitudes towards towards how things are. Her looking out. That's the way I can look out, and that's the way I can test. Her normative understanding of the world is that you can check by looking outside to see if my claim is true or not, is knowledgeable or not. That is only as filtered through the takings true of the one assessing the knowledge claim. It is irreducibly social. Epistemological, empirical questions, anything that has to do with the knowing are irreducibly social in this way, and they are worked out in the day-to-day, in the unfolding. So, what I will say about Hopi knowledge is, it's a claim expressing a believed, established truth that points to a standard, authority or tradition, and is given and taken as justification in discourses of assessment. That is, are you or are you not correct and knowledgeable in your claim to be doing something according to tradition? That is what Hopi knowledge is about. And I'll say that we can also, in fact, ask the same kinds of questions about the disclaiming and the refusing of Hopi access to Hopi tradition, Hopi traditional knowledge. And so now I'm going to march you through what I hope that you'll see is how and under what conditions this plays out and is possible. Oh, no, I'm not. First, I want to lay this out. I'm going to ask about Hopi's epistemological limits and ask, are claims to and for authority and claims against authority of others, is that what Hopi epistemological limits are? Are these claims to and for authority and claims against authority? Are they observable in discourses, in the discourse details? And are they always relational and implicitly invite recognition? These are the questions that I've reworked, the first questions that I've reworked to ask you in this way to think about as we move through the examples. So, you need now a little background from Hopi. Oh, no, you don't. Let me go right into some examples again. Who's heard of the Hopi snake ritual? Anybody? Who's heard of Abi Warburg? Abi Warburg heard of the Hopi snake ritual. He wrote about it. He actually didn't see the Hopi snake ritual, but it didn't stop him from writing about it. He went and saw a different one. He was there at the wrong time. Hopi snake ritual was an incredibly popular event at the turn of the 20th century. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt went at one time after he finished being president. Albert Einstein went at one point. It was a happening thing to take the train from Chicago to the Mesas, take a car, tour from a Fred Harvey, go all the way up, and you'd camp out and picnic and watch the Hopis dance their snake dances. And the thing about them that were spectacular was they danced with live rattlesnakes in their mouths, and still do. And so Heinrich Voth, who is the sort of generally considered the first great ethnologist, ethnographer of Hopi, and was a Mennonite missionary there, and learned the language and was quite impressive in that way, wrote, "Of the many rites and performances in the Hopi ceremonial calendar, none is perhaps better known in a general way than the snake ceremony, and yet no white person had ever been permitted to witness the secret part of the snake ceremony until the writer of this paper gained admittance." So Voth, like Stevenson, insisted on going into the kiva, though he was not a member or related in any way, went down in and proceeded to write, record, observe, transcribe the goings-ons there. But not without objection. They were afraid that their fathers, the snakes, might be angry, that my presence might interfere with the efficacy of the ceremony. They then begged me not to go with them anymore. No white man, they said, had ever seen nearly as much of their ceremony as I had. Very few had ever seen anything. I could see and hear everything else, only I should do them a favor and not go with them specifically on the snake hunt. So Voth agrees. Not wishing to incur the ill will of the people, I promised that I should not go with them anymore during that ceremony, but on the condition that they otherwise do not object to my seeing and studying everything else. And let me tell you, he saw and studied a whole lot. In fact, right now, in the archives, Voth was commissioned by the Stanley McCormick expedition from the Field Museum. He was paid by the Field Museum. His collections are at the field. His notes are at the field. His publications are at the field. The Hopi have asked that all of that stuff be sealed and only opened upon permission from the Hopi tribe, and the Field Museum has assented. They say that because this stuff is highly sensitive. And in fact, he went back and went back and went back multiple times, recording a lot of the songs, taking photographs, drawing, making full-size dioramas in glass cases that appeared on the floor of the Field Museum and were hugely popular for people who couldn't make the trip out to Hopi itself. Fast forward 20 years. In 1921, in Prescott, Arizona, a regular rodeo festival was happening, and it was falling on hard times. People weren't coming. So a group of guys who were in the local men's club got an idea. Let's dress up as Hopis, and we'll dance a snake dance. And so they painted their faces red, and they put on the buckskins, and they went out, and they did it. and it was hugely popular. These are now known as the Smoke-Eye. And the Smoke-Eye, starting in 1921, performed regularly what they called their Smoke-Eye snake dance. They would perform for almost 70 years. And this is how they describe themselves this is how they describe what they're doing in their history that they published. These ancient people, referring to the Hopi, used many beautiful and mystical ceremonies in their worship. Some of them are still given in their tribal homes, but have never been presented anywhere elsewhere until the Smoke-Eye people undertook to interpret them to their white brothers. Smoke-Eye have done this with sympathetic understanding of the ceremonies themselves and with an artistry acquired by close study and patient practice. Not unlike the hobbyists here in Germany, right? Well, maybe actually not quite like, but in some ways. This unique organization with dual purpose, that of serving and presenting the ancient ceremonial rites of a vanishing race and the collection of archaeological treasures. This is what the Smoke-Eye were doing. I should tell you, those of you who may be old enough to remember Barry Goldwater, Mr. Conservative, if you ever see a picture of Barry Goldwater, you'll notice that he has a little tattoo on one of his hands. This tattoo is a tattoo of membership in the Smoke-Eye. He was a regular member and a staunch supporter of the Smoke-Eye. He's from Phoenix, Arizona, so he'd go up for the trip and participate. I'd love a picture of Barry Goldwater in buckskin. I just would love it. If anyone has it in YouTube land. They even say that the Smoke-Eye have done this with skip that. They even say that there was an occasion when the Hopi themselves came to visit. The snake ceremonial leaders in particular came and visited. And of course, this was an incredibly mystical and important man who came in 1929 to see how the white man interpreted his most sacred rites. What doubts, what grave fears, what mixed emotions must have been his as he watched. He feared it might be some ribald mockery, some blasphemous ridicule of those things he holds in his innermost heart. They knew that these things were important. But thank goodness, the snake chief was very accommodating and actually liked the dances, as they report. And in fact, they were so deeply impressed. What man of any race could have been more kindly, more tolerant than was that snake priest, which almost sounds like that they were surprised that he was so kindly and tolerant. In fact, he wasn't. The very first act of the Hopi Tribal Council, which was created in 1936, but then formally organized in 1937, it's actually the second act. The first act had to do with ministerial stuff, was to outlaw, prohibit, and do anything they could to stop the Smoke-Eye. And they continued. They didn't. They were unsuccessful in stopping the Smoke-Eye. And as you can see from these records of various local newspapers and the like, with a gap in the middle for the wars, pretty much steadily there was one objection or another to the way in which the Smoke-Eye were performing these dances. Finally, leading up to 1990, when the Hopi take a cadre of folks from the Hopi reservation, ceremonial leaders, go there and insist upon a meeting with the Smoke-Eye and say, this has to stop. And in an interview with local reporters there at the time, the leader of this group, a man named Lee Kuanwasilma, said, the dance was an affront to Hopi people, to have others try to mimic something very sacred to us. On the other hand, it was also kind of funny, this romanticizing of Hopi culture, but looking at about 50 white guys trying to dance. I always love that. Lee now, you may remember from my first lecture, is the head of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. And in fact, it was this protest, and coupled with what else was going on in 1990, the passage of the Native American Graves Repatriation Act that led to the creation of the Cultural Preservation Office, passed by tribal law in 1990, giving them the responsibility to coordinate activities relating to laws which require consultation with clans, religious societies, village leaders, and others with regard to these matters. Here is a clip from the web page that you can still see at Hopi, of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, describing the circumstances that led to their decision to pursue the stopping of this. After non-Hopis saw ceremonial dances, choreography from ceremonial dances has been copied and performed in non-sacred settings. Although the Hopi believe the ceremonies are intended for the benefit of all people, benefits only result when ceremonies are properly performed and protected. It almost sounds like in the US you have these labels, warning labels. Benefits come only if properly performed and protected. Anyway, I like that. Benefits of ceremony. Anyway. Through the thefts, sacred rituals have been exposed, and this is deadly serious, to others out of context and without permission. Some of this information has reached individuals with whom it was not for whom it was not intended, and this is interesting. The first people named are Hopi youth, members of other clans, and then non-Hopi. Please be mindful of the personal ethics involved in and laws surrounding this issue. And yet, Mr. Kuwan Wasilma, shortly after stopping the Smoke-Eye dances, became a member of the Native American Advisory Council to the Smoke-Eye Museum, which has a substantial collection of Hopi material culture, including vases, pots, weavings and things, as well as photographs documenting the history of the snake dance, the Smoke-Eye snake dance. How do we make sense of that? Is it him being two-faced? Is it him wanting to get an advantage? Is it him just sort of changing his mind? Or is it something else? Hopi objections are well recorded, and yet so is the idea that while some object, right, each one of these objections was met by, well, some others seemed to approve. And it certainly is reported in the record as that, and while we were quick to sort of dismiss that, now, in light of other kinds of evidence, we have to think it again. Is it just a question of competing in various views within the community? I imagine it's partly that. Or is it possible that these expressions of limits of epistemological knowledge are not just shutting down relations, but inviting others? So now let me turn to arguing with tradition, this section. And I want to take even a bigger step back and tell you a little bit about Hopi. You saw this map before. This is a map of, the larger map is, the colored part is Hopi Aboriginal territory, which goes all the way to, I don't have my clickers not working, but anyway, then within that, a small section, the orangish part in the middle, is the current reservation. But that whole area is what Hopi people call Hopitutsqua. It is the area that they call their home, and from where they have always been, where they always will be, and how they understand their lives being lived in relationship to these places. The reservation itself is 1.5 million acres of this Aboriginal territory, surrounding the villages that they've always occupied. Well, not always in the archaeological record, but always from their perspective. There's a population approximately on the reservation of 13,700, not on the reservation, 13,700 tribal members, around 6,700 of which reside on the reservation. The tribe itself, and this becomes important, the tribe itself did not exist prior to 1936. It is a creation of federal law. And it was created with the passage of what's called the Indian Reorganization Act, which was an act that was ushered in to save what they felt was the horrible injustices caused by what was called the Allotment Act, the Dawes Severalty Act. And it was inaugurated by John Collier, who became Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who was an enormous, he had a great affection for the Pueblos in general, but Hopi in particular. And in fact, when talking about the passage of this act that federated the Hopi tribe and the Constitution, he went himself personally and met several times with the village leaders, and there are pictures of him meeting there. So Hopi was a special place to him, and he took a special hand in this, and it reads in the Constitution just how important it is. There are 12 villages that historically were independent and autonomous, each one not owing any obligations to the other. In the Constitution that was passed in 1936, pursuant to this federal act, it formed a representative tribal council with representatives from each of these 12 villages. It also gave them the power to create a tribal court, which they didn't create until 1972. But it also importantly reserved considerable parts of, and certain specific parts of life on the reservation to village authority itself. And most importantly, the areas that it reserved, most importantly for here and today, are things like adoptions of children, Hopi children, marriages and divorces, inheritance of property within the village, and property disputes. All the stuff that is the fabric, really, of, I think, what was viewed as Hopi life in many ways, though seen through the lens of the Western way of thinking about this Constitution. Now, when you go down into the village, you get to start to understand why this is. Misha Titiev was an ethnologist, an anthropologist in the 1930s and 40s, who described Hopi villages as an acephalous Hopi state. No head. Why? Because really the strongest identity within Hopi villages is not being a village member. Hopi people say their strongest identity is with their clan. These are matrilineal, ideally matrifocal clans, though this is not happening in this way anymore. And each of these clans is understood as having and holding a certain important obligation to perform a ceremony at the same time every year. That ceremony is what people in the kivas are preparing for. It's what men are doing when they're praying in the kivas. It's meant to bring rain or to bring other kinds of bounty to the communities in this arid part of the world. But also at the same time, each one of these ceremonies is in some way or another, and this is very loose, I'm giving you not the details, is a enactment of the original social order of the village. Why do I say that? What each of these clans are performing when they're performing this ceremony is they're performing the time when their clan was in the wilderness, on a migration. After they came out from the third world into this world, they went out, they were told to go out, and then eventually to learn things and then come back. On that route out, they went out and they learned certain sacred knowledge about how to operate the world, how to push and pull and force the natural forces of the world to work for the benefit of the Hopi people. And when they came back when they came finally and arrived to the Mesa villages where they were, the first clan, Bear Clan, established a village, and then the next clan, Spider Clan, came in and said, "We'd like admittance." And they say, "Well, what are you going to do for us?" And they said, "Well, we can perform this important ritual that we have knowledge of, and if it brought rain, if it was effective, yes, you can come in and you can have land." And then so and so and so forth and so forth. And each one of these clans then is enacting that originary moment of entering into and performing the ceremony that brought rain, that authorizes their place in the community. And the important thing is that each one of these clans is understood as having knowledge and efficacy that no other clan has access to. And that's why it's considered an acephalous Hopi state, but it's one that is always in the process of enacting its originary moment over and over again. And that's what these ceremonies perform. And rights to land and homes today, to this day, in many instances, are directly related to the rights and authorities that were passed down from those traditions, the rights and authorities that were granted to clans by virtue of by virtue of that originary moment. This is the knowledge. This is Navoti. Navoti, when you look at the term itself, means knowledge gained through hearing. And it is essentially pointing to the ceremonial practices where knowledge is passed. Secret, underground kivas, ceremonials. You can tell when someone is talking Navoti, even though they are talking about it or pointing to Navoti, because they use several different grammatical forms. They use this quotative particle yao, which means it is said, and they use it over and over and over again when they're talking. Or they use reportative verbs, like they're citing to somebody else. They say, one says, or they use this form that's very generic and habitual, what one does, what one should do, and invokes this kind of timeless sense of a kind of authority. And all point to the oral transmission of Navoti. But Navoti, as I said before, is power. And it is power, as I said, to influence, create, or transform events in the world. And it's not just to transform events in the world, it's to harness and tap into the vital forces of the entire world to bring about life. And that is seen as incredibly potent and incredibly dangerous. Prayers which conduct the pressure of the collective Hopi thought and will out of the subjective into the objective, that literally bring the world into being. That is what is happening when Hopi folks are praying, at least from Benjamin Lee Whorf's perspective. And as such, and because they're so volatile and dangerous, but also so evocative and important from a political perspective and from a social perspective, they're highly secretive. And so some people have access to them and many don't. And no clan will claim to have access to knowledge that is the knowledge of other clans. They recognize that other clans have knowledge, but they also recognize that they have theirs, and they don't know and don't claim to know those other people's knowledge, despite the fact that these are exogamous clans. So someone from my clan always is marrying someone from another clan, and that person's in that clan, the person they're married to doesn't tell them what their ceremony, what their traditional knowledge is. You can't know. Someone who is authoritative is a Navotiyataka, a man of wisdom. But it's not just wisdom in the sense of he knows the old ways of doing things, he also knows the truth. But at the same time, this manifesting, this bringing into the world, this diversion, this diffusion of knowledge is understood as fundamentally and necessarily incomplete. Lomayomtiwa Ishi is a critical historian, a Hopi tribal member. He's a professor at Northern Arizona University, and he says this: there's a long recognition that a total understanding of the entire Hopi scheme of things is never attainable. In one sense, this lack of centralized knowledge ensures that different clans and societies must carry their own weight for life to exist. And he says, this obviously is a problem for non-natives, but for us, the certainty with not knowing is a form of Hopi knowledge in which we know the limitations of ourselves in our society. As my friend Emery Sekyakwaptiwa once described, when Hopi men go down into a kiva and start to compose a song that the Katsina will sing, or a song that they hope the Katsina will sing, and they're working on this, and they're working with them, and they're working together, someone may be understood to have come up with the song initially, but it becomes part of the community, and it's always understood as both his and theirs. And the whole idea of Hopi life, he says, is the same. It's cooperation without surrender. Navoti, then, and its limits, as expressions of authority and relationality, mutual recognition, respect, and collaboration. Here's a Hopi village plaza where the Kachinas dance in the public part of the ceremony. Actually, I don't know if you can see back here, no, you can't. Here is a Hopi clan home, and that ladder is there because some kachinas, the koyamsi, go up top, and the woman who owns that, who's in control of that house, has to come outside and greet them, and if she doesn't greet them, they can't go up top to announce the dance that's to come. That's her clan responsibility, and that will come up in a case that I'm going to show you momentarily. Here's the Hopi Tribal Court. I showed this to you before. There it is. There's the court. And we're going to move into a little bit of the discussion of these actual cases. I'm running out of time, I know, so I want to make sure to hustle up. There's that Court of Appeals again. Hopi Court is very much influenced by Anglo-American style jurisprudence. Created in 1972, it has a trial and appellate docket. You can tell just by looking at how it's set up. There's a jury box, there's lawyers who are called, there's witnesses, a judge issues a verdict, and it's very much structured along this idea of issuing orders and opinions based on an Anglo-American adversarial style system. At the same time, though, Hopi tribe has authorized and demanded that the Hopi court take custom and tradition as precedent over other non-Hopi law. And it's a required form that the Hopi tribal court itself has acknowledged, or the appellate court has acknowledged, as important essence and necessary expression of Hopi values that needs and deserves respect when we are making decisions among litigants. But at the same time, they're hard to find. And moreover, there are some Hopi people who may or may not have an experience with Hopi traditions that resonate with or match with what the judges understand to be Hopi tradition. In fact, there may be some Hopi people who have lived most of their lives off the reservation. Are you going to hold them to these traditions? And so there's questions of contemporary negotiation that unfold. I have a lot of data. I did this back for several years. I took 49 case files, 30 hours of audio from 12 hearings that I observed, 4,700 pages of transcript that I analyzed. That was fun. I observed and I interviewed. And what I found was the dominant number of cases in which custom and tradition emerged was property disputes, which mirrors what was found by other scholars looking at a broad swath of tribal law. By far, the most use of custom and tradition was in issues of property. But it should point out that civil cases make up a very small portion of the actual work of the court, and yet they are outsized and important. So remember I told you about this hearing, and I asked you to think about it at the first, well, remember, those of you who were here the first lecture, I brought up a case, and this was this case between a woman and her 3 nieces over a plot of land. And the judge asked this question: can a woman who has left the community, right? She claims that she had inherited land from her father. Her nieces said he didn't. And they get into this back and forth. He asks her in Hopi how someone will go somewhere but continues to come back regularly. How often must she or he return and still have rights in that land? She said, the witness elder who was called said, this one woman never came back frequently. And he stops her and says, wait a minute, we're not talking about that woman. We're talking in general. We're not to look at some one person as we talk about this. This makes us, I'm going to skip this for a minute. This makes this woman very upset. She says, wait a minute, I thought we were supposed to be talking about these parties. I thought we were doing this only for them. But now it appears we're doing this for all. And he says, well, I'm asking for your traditions, your village's traditions. At that point, another elder jumps in and says, what are you going to do with the village's knowledge? And then says, that's something that probably no one will know very much about. In essence, shutting it down, and he did shut it down. This case ended up being dismissed. Nothing came of it. And what I argue is that when you look at how this is talked about, first of all, the judge is attempting to capture a sense of Hopi tradition that also matches expectations of general principles of law. And he uses a well-known Hopi genre of talk called ilkanta, admonitions. It's usually used in contexts where you want to chastise someone for acting badly, but you don't want to, name them. And so you do it very indirectly. And you say, what one would do in this situation is not put their gum underneath the table. What one would do when you talk in these generalizations. And the way you form that is you use an indefinite noun plus a habitual tense marked verb. And that's exactly what he's doing. What would one do when someone goes somewhere? Well, they're having none of it. And the reason they're having none of it, I argue, is because they are objecting to what they see as a grab of their authority. Because what this judge has a problem of is he knows the facts of the case, he wants the abstract principle, the rules, and he wants to be the guy that gets to put them together and to say, here's how we would order this. Well, these elders are not having any of it. They accuse him of being a white man. They basically say, why are you trying to do something that you should know better? There is no such thing as village traditions. We have clan traditions, and we are supposed to talk about what people in our own clans would do, and these parties are from our clan, and we can tell you about that. But that would require us to tell you what should happen to them, not what should happen in general. And the whole thing breaks down. Now I want to show you one more. It'll be quick. This is a dispute between a brother and a sister over a clan home left by their mother. The brother says, this home was left to me in a will, and the will made me the administrator. And the sister says, I have this home by traditional rights. It was that clan home I showed you where the people walk up on top. She says, it is required that a woman meet those kachinas when they come and feed them. Only a woman can have this. The judge, who is a Hopi woman from another village, says, attempts very hard to make this case just about who is going to be the testator who's going to be the administrator of this will, who is going to decide. Not getting into tradition, she really doesn't want to get into this judge. And at various places, the sister just absolutely refuses this. And I'll show you how this is accomplished. The judge says first, this is just on the appointment of the administrator and nothing more. And she reminds her, unless you can show that at the time the will was written on April 15th, 1999, you, the decedent, was incapable, could not understand what the content of the will was. Those are the only circumstances that a will can be set aside. She wants to make it just about this question of, is this a valid will, and does it name this guy as the administrator? That's it. The sister has an opportunity to cross-examine her brother, who is the guy who's claiming to have the will and have the house as a result. At some point in the questioning, the whole thing breaks down. She's no longer questioning him. She's just flat out arguing with him. And she says, I thought I was supposed to be the daughter. How come I thought they adopted me? How come how come I'm not getting anything and you're getting everything? And he tries to argue back with her. No. The thing about it is they did give you the house on top. Well, but I want more than that because I'm the one that's taking care of everything at the village. The nominal genre of talk here was supposed to be like a lawyer questioning a witness. You're not supposed to argue back and forth and make claims to truths about your knowledge. You're supposed to instead be questioning this witness and getting him to elicit his perspectives. The judge interrupts. Excuse me, to the sister. Okay, this is just a hearing on whether he should be appointed as the person. No. Because you had written a letter objecting to the appointment, we're having this hearing to determine whether he would be the proper person. The sister says, Distribute the property according to the will? No. Okay, all right. The judge is attempting to reframe this as just about the will. The sister is responding to this judge like she's directly questioning her and rejecting that effort. And in fact, the judge remarkably concedes and says, not so remarkable, but it wouldn't happen this way in an Anglo-American court, in a state court. The judge says, okay, opens the question up. Do you know why you do not wish to have the brother be named as the personal representative? And then the sister starts in. Yes, He'll just be, I for one, the house that he's getting, that's my house. I'm the one that's watching the kachinas, the mudheads that come around every year. I'm the one that's taking care of everything over there, and that's not a man's job, it's supposed to be a lady's job. She is actively producing the content of the tradition as she knows it. But it gets even better. A little while later, she actually performs it in Hopi. And she says, Pu'i, Dan is his name. Well, not really. Pampai taka, pamson put ang hin mani, piakai te mai tongwa, pam yao yap sin mui ooi ni, pam yao yap sin mui amongam no valaw ni, pang so sinom ilk singwa, iyan iyaw pantini, ka I pai son pantini, I taka. Notice the use repeatedly of yao, the quotative particle, that it is said. Will he, as it is said, be receiving the people? Will he, as it is said, be preparing the food? The people all come to that house. Can he, as it is said, do all that? No. I argue that what she is doing is performing her authority as someone knowledgeable in tradition without disclosing what those traditional knowledge is, and she's doing it by quoting to and citing to navoti, which is knowledge gained through hearing. And she's invoking that in a way that situates her within the line of tradition and authority in a way that is effective. So effective, in fact, that the judge dismisses the case and says, right, village, you take care of this according to your customs and beliefs. It works. But what the point that I'm trying to make here is that contestations around custom and tradition and who can know it and who should know it happen within the community just as much as they happen between community members and non-Hopi people. That these are the lines and limits of knowing. These are the ways in which authority is expressed and articulated. And these are the ways in which we can say that power and authority are being articulated in a way that both forecloses certain kinds of relations, but allows others. There was an amazing case I observed where a woman was on a witness stand, and she described this horrible moment where she saw her opponent. It was another property dispute, standing in the middle of the night, standing at this property, hair covering his face, all dressed in black. And she said, and I said to him, I knew who it was. I asked him, who is it? He didn't say anything. He was just standing there. In an interview with a consultant, I asked her about this, and she said, you know, all that black hair stuff, all the black, all the hair, all the middle of the night standing there, none of that matters. What matters is that he didn't respond. If he was really trying to get at them, in this mentally, in this way, to scare them, he wouldn't speak to them. The scary person never talks. Not talking is the key to this whole scary business. Well, what does scary mean here? She was accusing him of being a witch. She was accusing him of being very powerful and having knowledge about how to control forces in the world and using them for ill. She wasn't naming him that explicitly, but that's what that was. And the implications of knowing without having to say or refusing to speak and scaring you by not communicating is a way of marking a limit of knowing knowingly. That is, it marks a relationship between you and me that knows you will be afraid by my not disclosing to you what you want to know, which is, who am I? So epistemological limits work even when the knowledge isn't disseminated. They work to found relations. They work in an effort to invite further reciprocal obligation. Are they powerful? Yes. In the way that Hopi people understand them. Can they be used to coerce and commit violence? Yes. Can they be used to scare? Yes. Can they be used for instrumental reasons about political identity of some sort or another? Absolutely. But they are also not the end story, and they are an opportunity for thinking about ongoing relationship, because you have to know what it is you're not supposed to know. Thank you.